The Seahawks defensive line taking a big hit with one of their exciting rookies now done for the season. We're going to be breaking down the latest developments with Mike Morris and other roster moves heading into week 3 on our Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, the host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined here on our latest Matchup Wednesday by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s out there, whether you're listening down in Portland, Oregon, or across the country in Portland, Maine. We greatly appreciate you making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We're drawing closer to week 3, the Seahawks' second home game. They'll be hosting the Carolina Panthers. A flurry of roster moves today. We'll be breaking that down, including the unfortunate injured reserve designation for rookie Mike Morris. And then we'll be diving into all the key matchups to watch when the Seahawks host the Panthers this upcoming weekend at Lumen Field. This episode is brought your way by our friends at Prize Picks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedInNFL and use the code all lowercase LockedInNFL for a first deposit match up to $100. Now for your lead story here on our Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. The Seahawks taking a big hit along their defensive line, promising rookie Mike Morris, who played in the season opener and played quite well against the Rams in week 1 in a game where not many Seahawks played well. Morris was one of the bright spots. Unfortunately, it does not look like, Rob, we are going to get the privilege to watch him play again this season. He has been dealing with a shoulder injury. He missed the last 2 preseason games. They brought him back for the start of the regular season. He was cleared by doctors, felt like he was good enough to go, did play in that season opener, but missed last week's game, continuing to deal with the shoulder issue. And according to Pete Carroll, he is now going to undergo a surgery that is going to take months for him to recover from, basically ending his rookie season after just 1 game. And normally a 5th-round pick, you wouldn't say this is that big of a deal, but we know the depth concerns the Seahawks have on the defensive line, Rob. So I don't think that this loss can be understated, especially considering the upside that Mike Morris brought to this defensive line.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. Mike Morris is a 5th-round pick. Normally, you're not expecting much out of him, but, he is such a big man and was playing such a critical role for Seattle as one of the few players that have been able to hold up consistently in terms of run defense throughout the limited opportunities that we saw in the preseason and then in the regular season, where, as you said, he played very well against the LA Rams. And then the fact that Seattle just lacks depth at that spot. I have been encouraged by some of the other defensive linemen in Seattle's rotation. Certainly, I thought Mario Edwards had a terrific performance against the Detroit Lions, and we talked so much about Jay Reed and some of the other guys on Seattle's front. I was encouraged by Draymond Jones, but still, none of those players have the youth, have the stature, frankly, of a Mike Morris. So this is a disappointing development for Mike Morris individually and for the Seahawks collectively as well.
And I would think Myles Adams is going to be the one that's going to be called upon to take those snaps, even without Morris available, though he only played 4 snaps this past weekend. At some point, they are going to have to find some extra depth to that position now that it looks like Morris, unless he makes a remarkable recovery from this surgery, he is lost for the season. And today really was all about shoulder issues because at tight end, the Seahawks bringing in Brady Russell, an undrafted rookie that was on the Eagles practice squad, formerly of Colorado, the pre-Deion Sanders, pre-Coach Prime Colorado Buffaloes. And Brady Russell has a great story. He was a walk-on that ended up becoming a team captain and won several awards, caught over 70 passes in his time at Colorado. So certainly a guy to keep an eye on, but the reason the Seahawks are adding a tight end is because Will Dissly is apparently dealing with a shoulder issue that was became a bigger problem this past weekend, took a bump to that shoulder in the game against the Lions. And so he did not practice or is not supposed to practice today for the Seahawks. His status a little bit up in the air going into this game. on Sunday against the Panthers. So Brady Russell, come on in, might have an opportunity to get to play fairly quickly. I would think Tyler Mabry would be a practice squad call-up too if Will Dissly is not able to go. It's too early in the week to know, but certainly this was a move that I was a little bit baffled by, but now we can understand if Will Dissly is dealing with what hopefully is a minor shoulder injury.
That's the hope, obviously, But again, as we talked about with Mike Morris a moment ago, I think that we were cautiously optimistic that with Morris being able to play in that season opener extensively, then you might be, you were hoping that Will Dissly is going to be able to kind of brush this off as well and be able to recover. But of course, we know that Will Dissly has struggled with durability in the past, and so it is kind of disconcerting news at this point. I agree with you. While I'm encouraged by Brady Russell and what he demonstrated at Colorado, in his preseason tape with the Philadelphia Eagles, I 100% agree. I think it's going to be Tyler Mabry is most likely to get that move up. Tyler Mabry, of course, is nothing like Will Dissly. He's more of an H-back, but he has very good hands. He's a developing blocker, but he's not going to be basically that sixth offensive lineman that Will Dissly can provide. So I was very excited about how well Seattle's tight ends performed this past week against Detroit. I think they were a critical part of Seattle's victory. Losing Uncle Will, as he is kind of popularly known, could be a pretty significant blow, especially if it's going to be anything extensive. And there has been some other news for the Seahawks in terms on the injury front, but there's been some big news from the Carolina Panthers front as well with their quarterback. Of course, number 1 overall pick, Bryce Young, was reportedly held out of practice, on Wednesday as well. So there's going to be all kinds of injury news that are going to be going on throughout this week of practice. And hopefully we get to see all of these players with the exception of Mike Morris, as we talked about. But hopefully all of this is just kind of being cautious, and we get to see all these players for the Seahawks and for the Panthers on Sunday.
In additional Seahawks injury news, Riq Woolen still recovering from that chest injury that he exited Sunday's game at Detroit with. Pete Carroll made it sound like it is going to take a rapid recovery for him to be available this week, but it is not something that's going to be significant enough for him to land on injured reserve. So some good news and some bad news, at least in the short term with him, which further explains why Artie Burns was elevated, signed to the 53-man roster. Artie Burns going to get the opportunity to play a lot of snaps for the Seahawks this weekend against the Carolina Panthers. And Charles Cross, still day-to-day, did not participate in walkthroughs. Have to believe the Seahawks are going to continue to be cautious there, though, against this pass rush of the Panthers. If he is somehow close to being ready to go, the Seahawks might be tempted to have him back in the lineup at the left tackle position. So, again, wait and see on that front. Probably not going to be available this weekend, as will Riq Woolen probably not be available, but the Seahawks will be hoping that those two make really quick recoveries and they can maybe have them out there on the field for this week 3 contest. And as you mentioned with Bryce Young sitting out of practice on Wednesday, if he doesn't play, this is going to scare some Seahawks fans, because I think if you're looking for the backup that has caused the most problems for the Seahawks, Colt McCoy is obviously number 1, but public enemy number 2 has been Andy Dalton, who beat the Seahawks last year quarterbacking the New Orleans Saints, and he is 3-1 in his career as a starter against the Seahawks, and all those games have been in the Pete Carroll era. So he's been one of those guys that for whatever reason, he has been a kryptonite for the Seahawks. So if Andy Dalton gets to play the Red Rifle, even at this stage of his career, Seattle's had issues with Colt McCoy and Andy Dalton. So that might not be a good thing for the Seahawks if somehow Bryce Young is not able to play this upcoming weekend. So that is going to be a storyline to keep a close eye on. When we return, it is matchup Wednesday. We're going to look at the Seahawks on offense against the Panthers. Stout, aggressive defense. That'll be coming up next here on our Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Our partners at eBay Motors have teamed up with Locked On Fantasy Football host Vinny Iyer to bring you some of the best fantasy picks each week all season long. Whether you're prepping for a draft or scouting the waiver wire, every week we're going to provide you players that are a guaranteed fit on your roster. Heading into week 3, let's see who Vinny has picked out for us on this week's eBay Guaranteed Fit Fantasy Pick of the Week. Ravens rookie receiver Zay Flowers had a fine debut in week 1 before a more modest week 2, but Flowers will go into full bloom while cruising to a big game on a weak Colts secondary at home in week 3. Flowers will be schemed open well as Baltimore's new look passing game continues to find more life with Lamar Jackson. Vinny Iyer from Locked On Fantasy Football is going to help you win your fantasy championship, and eBay Motors knows a championship team is about each player being a perfect fit. Same with your vehicle. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you can make sure your ride stays running smoothly. Brake kits, LED headlights, roof rack, bumpers, whatever your baby needs, eBay Motors has it. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, it's guaranteed to fit your ride for the first time, every time, or your money back. Plus, at these prices, you're burning rubber, not cash. Keep your ride or die alive at ebay.com/motors. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. Welcome back. You're listening to the Locked On Seahawks podcast. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Ragg. And a special thanks to each and every one of the 12s out there for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. Don't forget, tomorrow is Crossover Thursday. I will be teaming up with Locked On Panthers, Julian Council, the lead host. The two of us will be diving in more into this upcoming matchup at Lumen Field between the Seahawks and the Panthers. You won't want to miss it. Speaking of that matchup, let's get to the matchup. Seahawks on offense, they got in a rhythm, putting up 30 points against the Lions in that tough road win on Sunday. They're going to be playing another stout defense. Even though the Panthers are 0-2, it's not because of their defense. They have been one of the best pass defense in the NFL. Their pass rush is ferocious, led by Brian Burns, and they've got a lot of talented players at all three levels. Even with J.C. Horn on injured reserve, and losing several other players to injury, they have been able to withstand those injuries so far, at least on the defensive side of the football. And so, Rob, going into this game, what is the number one matchup that jumps out to you for the Seahawks on offense that maybe would be a concerning one heading into this game?
Well, I think still we have to talk about the offensive tackles for the Seahawks. Assuming that Charles Cross is not going to be able to play, that Abraham Lucas is not going to be able to play in this game, then you assume that it's going to be Stone Forsythe and Jake Curhan again. Well, it remains to be seen. Maybe that Jason Peters is able to make his Seahawks debut. It remains to be seen there. But I have some real concerns about this particular matchup if it is, in fact, Stone Forsythe and Jake Curhan. Those of you who were able to watch on YouTube can see this statistics that Brian Burns has put up. Of course, there's only been 2 games. He already has 2 sacks. He has 9 tackles and a forced fumble. I thought that Jake Curhan played exceptionally well against Aiden Hutchinson. And, the formidable crowd noise that they had in Ford Field. And obviously, if you're now home at Lumen Field, then you're not going to have quite as many concerns about the crowd noise. But Brian Burns and his speed could be a kryptonite type of effect against a guy like a Jake Curhan. He is big, he is physical, he is tough. He basically is, in some ways, the offensive line version of Aiden Hutchinson. But he is not a dynamic athlete. That's one of the knocks on Jake Curhan, whereas Brian Burns is greased lightning off of the edge. So, again, I am comforted by the fact that Seattle's not going to have to deal with the crowd noise kind of a thing. It's not going to allow Brian Burns to have that early jump advantage that so many of the speed rushers in today's game really can rely on. Brian Burns is an explosive pass rusher. And meanwhile, on the other side, you have Stone Forsythe, a big man who can struggle a little bit with classic bull rushers, and that's Justin Houston's game on the other side. So, Again, the fact that Seattle is at home is certainly an advantage, but the Carolina Panthers quietly have a pass rush that I think is every bit as fearsome as what we were worried about with the Detroit Lions a week ago.
And they also have depth at that position. You've got Yetur Gross-Matos, a former second-round pick out of Penn State. That's one of their backups that is more than capable of winning with power, and he's an underrated athlete. He's got kind of a balanced attack. And you got Amari Barno, who is another pure speed rusher out of Virginia Tech that can come in right after Brian Burns. So they can bring the speed at you off the edge consistently with 3 of those 4 players. And Justin Houston is still a very effective pass rusher, even at this stage of his career in his mid-30s, a guy that's had a lot of success getting after quarterbacks in the NFL. So you consider those 4. Frankie Louvu can also play some off the edge as well for the Panthers. They've got a lot of weapons that they can use there. So the backup tackles, assuming that they're going to be the ones out there again this weekend, we know at least one of them is going to be with Abraham Lucas on injured reserve and not able to come back at least for 3 more games. But even if Cross plays, coming off an injury, this is going to be a very difficult matchup for the Seahawks to be able to deal with the the stable of pass rushers that the Panthers can throw at them, different styles of pass rushers, and they are very effective. Almost a 13% sack rate in the first 2 games, tied for the 3rd highest in the NFL. As far as the next matchup for me, this is where I think the Seahawks could have an advantage. And at the same time, even without J.C. Horn, I feel like the Panthers still have a pretty solid secondary, especially that quarterback group. But Tyler Lockett, DK Metcalf, JSN, going up against CJ Henderson, and Jackson is going to be the other starter on the outside with J.C. Horn not being available in this game on injured reserve. They've still got some talent there with Henderson and Jackson as their 2 starters, a lot of starting experience with those 2 players on the outside, and 2 different style players. Henderson is more of the really athletic ball hawking type player, whereas Jackson would fit the mold of what the Seahawks have looked for in the past, of a bigger bodied corner that could play physical press coverage in the line of scrimmage, will come up and hit you. A good athlete, but different playing styles. Both these guys have been effective, though, and the Panthers have given up less than 300 passing yards combined in their first 2 games. They are ranked 3rd in the entire NFL for passing yards given up. So it's not just the pass rush. This secondary has been really good. Even without their best corner, J.C. Horn, available, they have found ways to get it done. So this is a team that's got a lot of depth and a lot of talent in that quarterback spot, and that should make this a really fun matchup. If Geno Smith's got time to throw, you still like Seattle's receivers against these corners without J.C. Horn at the same time. This is not going to be one of those games where there's a huge drop-off with a starter being out. You still got 2 very solid starters in the quarterback position capable of making big plays.
I 100% agree with you. I think that, I get to use a word here that some of the people out there in the football analytics business like to use. I think they're a lot smarter than I am, and it's kind of regressed to the mean, that expression. I think that when you look at who the Carolina Panthers played in the first couple of weeks, the Atlanta Falcons and the New Orleans Saints. The Atlanta Falcons, of course, are going to try to run the ball right down your throat. The quarterback is Desmond Ridder, a second-year quarterback. Again, their identity is running the ball. And while the Saints have made some changes, of course, brought in Derek Carr, they don't have the dynamic wide receiver play on the outside. So that, to me, is one of the reasons why I think that the Carolina Panthers, their statistics against the pass is a little bit misleading. I think that this is a talented group, as you mentioned, even without J.C. Horn out there. So I am confident in Geno. In Geno Smith, and I'm very confident in Seattle's wide receivers. We saw the critical plays that DK Metcalf made a week ago, and obviously the game-winning plays that Tyler Lockett made throughout the game. And maybe this is the game that we see Jackson Smith and Jake Bobo kind of, prove themselves to be worthy of some more playing time, because Carolina's top 2 cornerbacks are pretty solid. I do think that they might have some questions in terms of their depth, and so maybe at the nickel or even dime spots, Seattle might be able to take advantage of that. But if you're just banking on Seattle being able to throw the ball all over the yard because they don't have their star and J.C. Horn out there, I think that there could be some concerns in this way. So it's going to take another spectacular performance from Geno Smith being able to step up into the pocket and be able to fire some of those lasers like he did for Detroit, if the Seahawks are going to emerge out of this game 2-1 rather than 1-2.
And looking at our last matchup, and you and I were in agreement on this one when we pre-planned this going into the show. What are the 3 big matchups on both sides of the ball? And Carolina is dealing with some injuries. Former Washington standout Shaq Thompson injured his ankle on Monday night, and he's going to miss extensive time. They just put him in injured reserve, so he is definitely not going to be playing in this game. But one of the major nuisances for the Seahawks the last couple of years, it's ironic because he comes from Washington State. I mean, he is a Pacific Northwest guy, at least from his college background. But Frankie Louvu has been a Seahawk killer the last couple of years, and he is off to a red-hot start. So looking at that run game and the pass-catching ability of Ken Walker III and Charbonnet going up against Carolina's linebackers, Frankie Louvu has 2.5 sacks so far this season, 3 tackles for loss, 14 tackles. He's been all over the field. He's a good run defender. You can move him different parts of the formation. Again, he has been a major problem. I thought he was their best player when the Panthers came to Seattle and upset the Seahawks last year. He was all over the field, dominant, rushing the passer, getting after the run, getting off blocks, had a pass breakup in that game. He did everything. So he is a player that scares me. And at the same time, without Shaq Thompson available, I look at this group of linebackers, and I feel like this should be a game. The Panthers have had some issues defending the run. I think the linebackers have been part of that with the injuries they've had at that position. It feels like if you could get to the second level, I like the ability of Ken Walker III and Zach Charbonnet to be able to do some damage at the second level of the Panthers defense.
I agree with you. And I love that you mentioned Ken Walker III as well as Zach Charbonnet. And those of you who, again, are watching on YouTube can see that the picture is actually of Zach Charbonnet, which might surprise some people considering Ken Walker III, of course, had a couple of touchdown runs in this past game against the Detroit Lions, including an absolutely dynamic cut, that I kind of talked about a little bit in yesterday's show. But it's Charbonnet versus Luvu, two former Pac-12 stars, I think is especially interesting because you're right. Luvu just kind of comes downhill with a ferocity that you don't see in today's NFL anymore. I kind of miss linebackers who play with that type of physicality. So to see Zach Charbonnet, who I've just been very impressed by his physicality, his just sheer desire and want to, I want to see these two forces just kind of collide a couple of times. Like two great horned sheep or something up on a mountainside. I think that it could create, the kind of cracks that maybe will get the Lumen Field, the fans at Lumen Field that much more excited. And of course, you want to see the dynamic athleticism that is K9 out there as well. So I really think it's going to be kind of a fun matchup. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention Derek Brown, the big defensive lineman. To me, he is one of the underrated and kind of rising stars along the defensive line in all of the NFL. And so, as you said, if the Seahawks can get to that second level, that's going to be, I think, a little bit more difficult than some are anticipating. And so I think that it's going to be an interesting matchup because you're right. This is a matchup I was excited to talk about, but I also was excited about Damian Lewis and Phil Haynes, of course, the center, Evan Brown, going up, especially against Derek Brown. I think that's going to be an interesting matchup of some really good physical young players that could absolutely turn this game on its head.
When we come back, we're going to switch gears to the Seahawks on defense going up against a Panthers offense that statistically at least has really struggled here these first 2 weeks going off to an 0-2 start. We'll get to those matchups coming up next year on our Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by Prize Picks. Prize Picks is the largest independently owned daily fantasy sports platform in North America. It's the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. It's just you against the numbers. Instead of battling thousands of other players, including pros and sharks, you pick more than or less than on 2 to 6 player stat projections and watch the winnings roll in. Prize Picks is really simple to play. I can make my picks and submit my entry in less than 60 seconds. This week on Prize Picks, I'm picking Ken Walker III to rush for more than 75 yards, and I'm looking for Derrick Henry to eclipse 80 rushing yards. It's all about the running backs this week. Prize Picks is an absolute blast each week, and it's an easy way to enjoy daily fantasy without the hassle and land quick winnings. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedNFL and use the code LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match up to $100. That's prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use the code LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks, daily fantasy sports made easy. Welcome back to the Locked On Seahawks podcast. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang, here for Matchup Wednesday. And a special thanks to each and every one of the 12s for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. It's time to get back to the key matchups. We just looked at the Seahawks on offense against the Panthers on defense, and we wrapped up with Seattle's running backs against Carolina's linebackers. And I feel like we have to flip the script here when we're looking at this game, because if you remember last year in December when Carolina came to Seattle and won at Lumen Field, the main reason they were able to do it, the Seahawks could not stop the running game for the Carolina Panthers. And they have added Miles Sanders, who had a 1,000+ yard season for the Eagles last year, helping them get to the Super Bowl. They've still got Chuba Hubbard as one of their backups. They got a couple other good running backs in their roster, and they are one of the best rushing teams in the NFL, in the top 10 in rushing yards, top 5 for yards per carry. So this is going to be a test for Bobby Wagner, Jordyn Brooks, and assuming that Devin Bush is healthy enough to play this week, those three are going to have to deal with this stable of running backs that can run the ball, and in the case of Miles Sanders, can also do a lot of damage catching the football out of the backfield.
Yeah, it's been one of the statistics that actually has kind of surprised me the most from the Seahawks is I heard that Seattle is actually allowing just 2.9 yards per rush And that kind of surprises me because it felt like at times that the Detroit Lions and the LA Rams were kind of able to, kind of do whatever they want to do in the running game. Certainly were some big runs. And I see a player like a Miles Sanders, certainly a Chuba Hubbard, who have had some success against the Seahawks in the past. So I 100% agree. I think that this has to be the matchup that we focus in on early on. It was one of the matchups that we had, or one of the positional groups along the defensive line that even entering the season, we had some concerns about. So I think this is an interesting one. Bobby Wagner, of course, is the man in the middle. He's going to be one of the players that we're going to be focusing in on here, but Jordyn Brooks and Devin Bush as well. I think that regardless of who was playing quarterback for the Carolina Panthers, if it's the rookie Bryce Young, then of course Carolina is going to want to protect him a little bit with the running game. But even if it is Andy Dalton, then I think that, again, Carolina is going to want to come in and try to erase the noise element that the Lumen Field crowd could bring. So I think that this is the matchup that the Seahawks have to win if they're going to be able to kind of control this game the way that they are hoping to do so.
I think the Seahawks, you look at this game, and this is kind of going off the run game, and at the same time, it's also looking from a passing game perspective, regardless of whether Bryce Young or Andy Dalton is the one that's playing quarterback. Two different styles. Bryce Young is going to be much more likely to do damage with his legs. But I think this game really boils down to, we saw the difference from week 1 to week 2. The defensive line in the interior was non-existent for most of the season opener against the Rams. And that was a huge problem for them, giving up 17 points or 23 points unanswered in the second half to the Rams. This past game, especially the second half, we really saw that interior line, including Draymond Jones, come to life, getting a sack, getting multiple pressures on Jared Goff. And I think that was one of the big difference makers for being able to come out of Detroit with the upset. And I look at this Panthers team, and their offensive line has struggled a little bit these first 2 games in pass protection, particularly in the interior. Ekwonu, who they drafted in the top 10 last year at left tackle, he's more known for his run blocking ability. He has shown some vulnerabilities in the pass game. But you look at where the Seahawks could have an advantage here. I think Draymond Jones, his athleticism, going up against a center like Bradley Bozeman, who is more of a big-bodied guy that drives people off the ball. He can have some issues, though, with quick, athletic pass rushers. Even Jaron Reed could be a problem for him inside. Miles Adams with a more extensive playing time regimen. Mario Edwards, we saw his explosiveness and his ability to penetrate a couple times against the Lions. I just look at this Panthers team. The strength of their O-line is their 2 tackles. I feel like the interior, the center, and guard spots that Seattle should be able to hold up against the run, but I really like their chances to be able to collapse that pocket, especially if Andy Dalton's back there. Not that he's a complete statue, but he's not a guy that's going to be running around a lot. If you can collapse that pocket on him, even at this stage of his career, he'll uncork some throws into tight coverage. Seattle got him a few times last year, even though they lost to the Saints in that game. They did pick off Andy Dalton a couple times in that game, and interior pass rush contributed to that. Can you do it again here with him in a different uniform? And Bryce Young, he's 5'10" with really tall cleats on. So a guy like that, if you can collapse the pocket on it, we've seen it with Kyler Murray, it really limits where that smaller quarterback can throw on the football field. So I think the interior pass rush is going to be crucial going into this football game.
No question about it. I think that Carolina's talent on the offensive line, as you said, is really on the outside. I do think that, again, the speed of Seattle's pass rush, certainly a Darrell Taylor, the physicality of a guy like Uchenna Nwosu, who I was remiss in not mentioning in yesterday's show when I was talking about resiliency. I mean, how about the hit that he put on to basically turn the game on its head, in last week's, upset win, frankly, in Detroit. I do think that they have an advantage, but yes, especially if it's Bryce Young, because of the height factor, because he played at Alabama, he was used to not getting much pressure in his face. I think that's one of the reasons why, as you astutely pointed out in yesterday's show, about just the fact that the Carolina Panthers, despite the fact that that Bryce Young has had lots of time in the pocket, they still are among the teams that have been sacked the most so far. Maybe that's one of the reasons why Bryce Young hasn't been able to play. It's because he is getting as many hits as he is. Whether it be Bryce Young, whether it be Andy Dalton, a quality interior pass rush, I think is going to be, it's something that the Carolina Panthers Panthers are going to struggle with all season long. And so it's on Seattle to be able to take full advantage of that. You mentioned Myles Adams before. To me, Draymond Jones, you're hoping, is going to assume that role as Seattle's best interior pass rusher. But Myles Adams, we've seen it happen over and over again in Seattle. He does have that quickness. Whether he gets the sack or not, he can force quarterbacks to kind of move their feet a little bit. So to me, certainly you're hoping that's going to be Draymond Jones. If not, I think that Myles Adams could perhaps provide a little bit of that pass rush. But I do think it's critical that Seattle be able to get some pass rush, whether it be the outside or more likely on the inside in this football game.
Seattle will be dealing with a familiar foe on the outside. He's just wearing a different uniform. All those years that the Seahawks played the Vikings in a row, and it felt like it was like 5 years in a row that they played at Lumen Field. But Adam Thielen was always a player who seemed to step up when he played against the Seahawks. Had some really big games, and he's one of those big-bodied slot receivers out there that has given the Seahawks some problems. Now, he's 33. He's not the same player he was a few years ago in terms of athleticism. That's one of the reasons the Vikings decided to move on from him. He's had a few injuries, but this is a completely overhauled Panthers offense that DJ Shark and Adam Thielen are really their top two targets, and Thielen has been the go-to guy here early for Bryce Young. And you know Andy Dalton is going to want to throw the football. When you have two veterans like that, they're going to want to hook up several times. Depending on who the quarterback is, I still think that Adam Thielen is going to be that top target. And that ability to win in the slot is something that I don't want to say it concerns me going to this game, but as we talked about yesterday with Artie Burns getting signed to the 53-man roster, that in part was to help with that slot cornerback position. You've got Julian Love, who has struggled in coverage. Kobe Bryant has given up a lot of catches as well. That has been the one spot that it feels like in both games Seattle has been vulnerable against the pass. Adam Thielen is a guy that still has the ability to put up big numbers, even in this offense that has struggled. And so I do look at this as a matchup where those corners, whoever's playing the slot spot, you better step your game up, because Adam Thielen is a guy that can do a ton of damage even at this stage of his career. And that has been the soft spot in this defense so far.
It really has. The nickel corner spot, the safety spot against tight ends. So whether it be Adam Thielen and Hayden Hurst are the two that concern me the most from a Seahawks perspective, because the Seahawks have struggled. It feels like for years and years against slot receivers and tight ends. So whether it be Kobe Bryant, whether it be a Julian Love, whether it be a Artie Burns, whether the Seahawks move Devin Witherspoon or Trey Brown inside, as you and I have talked about that possibility in the past, I'm intrigued by what Carolina has on the outside in Chark and in Mungo, the wide receiver that they drafted this year. Two big, tall, fast receivers. And if Rick Woolen is not back for the Seahawks, as we talked about, that may not be the case, then I think the Seahawks could be vulnerable on the outside as well. But where we know they've been vulnerable is in the slot nickel position. So again, Adam Thielen being the crafty receiver that he is, I think that is a position of concern. I mean, Amon-Ra St. Brown and Puka Nacua just demonstrate over and over again, much to the concern of Seahawks fans everywhere, that is still a position of concern for the Seahawks. And so until they prove that they can slow that down, that has got to be, I think, definitely one of the matchups that the Seahawks have to be focusing in on. And again, with the tight end Hayden Hurst, that has been an area of concern as well. That's why, as we talked about before, the interior pass rush in particular, I think, is going to be important to perhaps be able to get their hands up. If you can't get to the quarterback and sack him, maybe get your hands up, get a tipped pass from a shorter Bryce Young or for an aging Andy Dalton that might be able to get the kind of pick six like Trey Brown provided the Seahawks a week ago, that, again, might be able to kind of turn the game around for the Seahawks.
As always, you can follow me on Twitter at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Subscribe Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and wherever you listen to your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. Coming up tomorrow, I'll be joining the Locked On Panthers crew, and we'll have our latest crossover Thursday installment as we continue to dive deeper into this upcoming matchup at Lumen Field. You won't want to miss it, and thanks for listening in to today's show. Enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. Go Hawks.